Okay.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nicholas Siegfried from law firm Siegfried Rivera, joined here with Donald Kipnis to discuss our program for today, which is Framing the Construction Project Commencement. Just a little bit of background before we get started. I'm board certified in construction law. I've been practicing construction law almost about 15 years now. Teach construction law at the University of Miami Law School. Handle all types of construction litigation from 558 turnover litigation to breach of contract, payment disputes, construction defect litigation, as well as handle negotiation of construction contracts. Donald, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do?
Thanks, Nick. I am a owner's representative representing condominium associations and commercial developers, educational facilities. I have been a general contractor since 1983. I have assisted with litigation support, contract negotiation, procurement, design, dispute resolution, project closeout, review of defects. Over 37 years, we've seen a lot.
So the point of this program is to kind of take you through kind of a legal perspective of things as well as a practical kind of boots on the ground perspective with Donald, and try to give you some pointers and things to think about whether you're in a construction project right now or you're gearing up for a construction project, or perhaps you've completed your project and there's issues and there's potential claims from either you or the contractor, depending on what side you're on. So let's talk a little bit about kind of where we're at with construction in South Florida, and we'll kind of start with what everyone is dealing with, which is COVID-19. Donald, how or what effects have you seen on the construction industry due to COVID-19?
Fortunately, construction has not been impacted significantly due to COVID-19. Our active projects have minimal claims, minimal delays. The future might be different because of manufacturing limitations. We're already seeing price escalation and longer lead times.
Right, and that was certainly one of the effects or potential effects of COVID-19. Certainly, one concern is a lot of materials are purchased from China. When this pandemic started, China was shut down and it was difficult to get materials. So contractors were forced to come up with alternatives and different distributors to get materials. And certainly contractors would look to pass those costs along to the owner. And in those situations, it's important for the contractors and the owner to be aware of what those claims are. And we emphasize to both our owner clients and contractor clients to document the issues that they were facing, whether it's health related and labor shortages, or material issues and problems getting materials, and to make claims and to document the claims appropriately. One of the things that, in terms of a legal perspective with COVID-19, is look at the contract, right? As attorneys, we try to anticipate things that may occur in the future. One of those things is, in some circumstances, is something like a pandemic. And a lot of contracts will include a force majeure provision, which allows for an excuse not to perform the contract, but only in certain limited circumstances and in defined circumstances that the parties actually agree to. So it's important if anybody is facing a delay or a claim delay from a contractor or even a subcontractor due to COVID-19, you got to open the contract and take a look at it and see what it says. See if a pandemic is specifically covered. Some force majeure clauses are typically broad enough to say anything any circumstance beyond a contractor's control, which would certainly, in my opinion, be COVID-19. Some provisions will say acts of God. Well, you would think an act of God could be a pandemic, but I've seen interpretations of acts of God distinguishing COVID-19 on the basis that COVID-19 and the spread is due to human factors as opposed to an act of God like a hurricane. So don't be so sure when you just see an act of God that that's going to be a pandemic. These issues and claims are still need to be worked out through the courts, and it's still kind of up in the air how a court will address or interpret force majeure and acts of God provisions with respect to any delay claims due to COVID-19. Let's talk a little bit about contractors in South Florida. I was telling Donald that I only see the problems. I only get called in when there's a dispute or bad workmanship or contractor walked off the project. But Donald, what has your experience been with contractors, and what is the quality of work in South Florida right now?
We've experienced fairly good quality of work. The contractors are conscientious. It's important to select the right contractors and the right subcontractors and material suppliers at the onset. Certainly there have been some challenges, but they've managed it well. The initial selection is really critical, and then having the design professionals and third-party inspectors inspect the work during the progress of the work is also critical.
And, I think it's a lot about personalities with contractors, and there's a team that everyone is part of in terms of a construction project. So typically, the first people in terms of an owner that an owner will talk to is an architect or an engineer, or perhaps somebody like Donald regarding a project. And when you have a construction manager like Donald or an architect or engineer already involved in a project, you want to consult with them as to any potential bidders, because if they've had good experience and worked with them in the past, then that's going to help your project tremendously. If they've had disputes and fights and disagreements, I don't know if it's going to get any better or be different on this project. And I've seen that. It's just some architects and engineers, they like certain contractors that they work well. So you need to get the input. It can't only be about price. It's got to be about the relationship between the parties. Do you agree with that, Donald?
I do, and the initial price is rarely the ending price. So those relationships are critical. The quality of the drawings, what's been excluded, what are allowances, and how the parties resolve issues that arise and the timeliness of that.
So one issue that we're going to talk a little bit about is unforeseen conditions. And that's kind of an issue that's always been around in construction projects and is still around and kind of a hot topic today. And it occurs where the condition of the site is different than what was anticipated by the contractor going into the project. Can you give, before we get into kind of the legal issues, Donald, can you give us some examples of where a contractor would experience an unforeseen condition?
Sure. Let's say that an interior remodel is being done. There's no evidence of mold, and the contractor opens up the wall only to find that there has been previous water damage and the wall has mold, the drywall has mold behind it. That would be an unforeseen condition.
Right. So typically in contracts, there's a couple of ways to deal with that. One, it's, hey, contract, you're taking this project as is, okay? Any issues you find, that's on you. You got to deal with it. That would be an unforeseen condition, and the provision would be any condition that you find, you have to deal with it. It's your responsibility. Or there's negotiated provisions that deal with unforeseen conditions, such as the one that Donald mentioned, and it would be a question as to whether the contractor should have saw it or it's really unforeseen. But that's something that's certainly negotiated between the parties, and it's a risk to both parties that needs to be addressed at the time of contract negotiation. So let's continue on to permitting. Sounds simple enough, right? Get the plans, get the permit, get started. What can go wrong, Donald?
Well, a lot of things. Your neighbors can complain, adjacent buildings if you're doing exterior changes, but that's the small of it. Permits are very complex, and it is a significant effort to get permits to remodel. The fire department looks at it, and many other disciplines within the building department for electrical, plumbing, building compliance, ADA compliance. If you're moving trees, environmental, there are boundary surveys that have to be up to date. It can take 6 months to a year to get a permit, or longer. So it's a hurdle, and then once you're issued a permit, the scope of the work is specific, and you want to stay within that scope of work. We rarely see permits that are issued and then not revised at some subsequent time. So the timeliness of revisions can control the continuation and completion of the work.
So I know we have some property managers, maybe some board members. What should they be concerned about when we're at the beginning here, ready to get the permit? It's exciting. What should they be doing or looking out for?
It's important to understand the scope of work that is described in the permit submission plans and specs, and leave enough time to procure that permit so that the job starts timely. The permit document should be reviewed carefully with the board, the contractor, the management company, everyone involved, architects and engineers, which helps to reduce any misunderstandings or missteps.
And permitting, that's step one in terms of the actual construction of the project. No construction can actually take place until there's a permit. So you'll see in a lot of contracts that the completion date or the time for completion is tied to the issuance of the permit, because it's subject to the municipality having jurisdiction over the project. So until they issue that permit, the days to complete the project typically don't start. So it's important to, just when negotiating a contract, to have it clear, what is the start date? And in many contracts, it is, well, once that permit is issued. Once that permit is issued, you'll have whatever the time period is, 100, 200, 300 days to complete the project. Some things that are typically negotiated in a contract regarding permits is who will pay for it. In our experience, typically that's a cost that's passed along to the owner, and the owner will pay for it. But just beyond just the initial permit that's issued to the owner, are there any other permits that owners should be aware of that are going to be applied for under the master permit?
Yes. Typically, when the master permit is issued, which the owner pays for, which saves the contractor's markup on the permit fee, there are specialty permits for mechanical, electrical, plumbing, fire alarm, fire sprinkler, and there may be others. So those permits need to be tracked. We like to have a weekly permit meeting or a component of the weekly owner, architect, contractor meeting that deals with the tracking of permits enabling us to expedite the issuance of the subcontractor permit so that their work can be inspected.
And certainly a sign that a sub may be delaying a project is his failure to at least apply for a permit. Do you agree with that?
Yes, applying for a permit is a first step for a sub to be issued a permit. But he's got to have his license active, insurance, and permitting, I said earlier, it's very difficult. And it's an activity that must be diligently pursued. We use permit expediters because they have relationships, they understand the system and how to get through it, and everyone should use a permit expediter.
That's a good point. Well, Dono, sometimes permits just take too long, right? Can't we just get started? This is a hypothetical question. What happens if we just, go ahead and start doing some work and no one will notice, right?
Well, someone will notice. It will likely get reported. It's illegal. Then when you go and apply for a permit, the job will get red tagged and stopped. When you apply for a permit, it will be scrutinized in even more detail. The permit fee will then be a multiple depending on what happened. There are guidelines, double or more of what a regular permit fee would be. It's not the right way to do it.
Right. And that's legally, just do it the right way. It's easy, simple legal advice. Follow the process, get the permit, and then start.
Right, and how would you post the notice of commencement if you don't have a permit? Which is essential, to post the notice of commencement on the job, which legally protects the owner.
All right. You're only going to be able to, even if you were to start, you're only going to be able to get so far, and it's not worth the risk to your project. All right, next hypothetical. Contractor applies for and receives a permit and then performs work that is not included in the permitted plans. What happens there? And I think this is not some crazy hypothetical where it's, somebody has a permit to build a house and they want to build in a condo. It's things change on a project. The owner decides to do different things, maybe use installs a different type of roof, and there's a change that needs to be made to the plans. But Donald, can you just take us through, does that need to go through the city or county for approval and a revised permit? When do changes need to actually, when do we need to get a permit for a revised permit for any changes?
First, I've participated in hundreds of projects. All of them have had changes. Typically, they're made by the owner when they have second thoughts about design or see what's being built because they're not familiar with reading plans. They tend to result in delay of project. So change is the enemy of timely and cost-effective construction. It's critical that the plans be reviewed thoroughly and in detail. Every elevation, the ceiling, the floor, the function, the furniture layout, the finishes, before the master permit is issued. But if changes are made, which they seem to be always made, the sooner the revision is submitted, the better. When the inspectors come out to inspect, for example, electrical rough-in, and the outlets are different in number or location than the permitted plans call for, they may not sign off on the plans, which would stop drywall from being hung. That's a delay to the project.
Right, and in terms of project documentation, if it ever gets to somebody like me, an attorney dealing with litigation or claims, all these issues, owner changes, like you said, affect the project. Could be a claim for a delay or an extension of time at a minimum because of a change in the scope. So the contractor is going to be able to establish through, hey, there was a change. Here's the change order. How to get a revised permit. That takes time. I'm entitled to additional time for this work. And you know, it's one thing. Yes, legally we need to do it because we need to comply with the law, and the municipality or county needs to know what we're doing, and the inspectors need to review it and approve it. But two, this is part of the project documentation. Things need to be documented, things need to be revised, because even once the project's done and perhaps a change then needs to be made or repair needs to be made to some system, where you're going to want to see that there were revised plans for that system, that they were properly permitted. Because if you ever need to make a change to something and get a new permit, well, the city's going to want to see that what was done before was actually permitted and approved. So you need, as whether it's an owner or a contractor, you want proper documentation on the project, and this is just another element of that. So let's go on to, we're moving ahead on the project. We got the permit. Now it's time to start, and we need a notice of commencement. And the notice of commencement is required to be recorded on the property and posted at the job site prior to the commencement of any work. And it's a crucial document. I think if anybody has been on or even done work on whether their home or on a commercial property, they probably dealt with or were asked to sign a notice of commencement. So notice of commencement, legally what it requires information about the property, the legal description, the address, whether the property is owned in fee simple or leasehold interest, requires information about who the owner is, service of any notices required under Chapter 713 Florida statutes, which is the lien law, where those notices are to be sent. Information as to any payment and performance bonds needs to be identified in the notice of commencement. Also, if there is a payment bond that's provided by the contractor, it needs to be attached and recorded along with the notice of commencement. Only when that payment bond is attached to the notice of commencement does it relieve or excuse the owner's property from being subject to liens. But unless that notice of bond or unless that payment bond is recorded along with the notice of commencement, subcontractors and suppliers can lien the owner's property. So a couple points here. One, always have your attorney review the notice of commencement. It seems like a very simple thing. I've seen numerous circumstances where a contractor will prepare a notice of commencement for the owner to just sign. The owner thinks that, hey, it's just some other building department document, I got to sign it, here you go, here's my signature, don't bother me anymore about it. But the owner needs to review the information, because it really only affects the owner if there's bad information in there. Because what happens is a subcontractor or supplier is going to look at that notice of commencement and look at the addresses and send their notices to owner based upon the addresses in that notice of commencement. So if the contractor is just, putting in information, is not verifying it, is not asking the owner whether this information is correct, whether the address is correct, puts in the wrong address, well, guess what? All those notices to owner from the subs and suppliers are going to go to a wrong address. The owner's not going to get it. The owner's not going to know who's on the project, and the owner's not going to know who to get releases the lien from. And that's going to be the owner's problem, not that of the subcontractor and supplier. So be cautious with the notice of commencement. It's very important. It needs to be accurate, and it needs to be signed by the owner, not signed by the contractor, as I've seen in other circumstances. And in terms of your project, that building inspector is actually going to look to make sure that notice of commencement is recorded and is actually posted at the job site before he performs any inspections. So if it's not there, your project's not going to get an inspection and it's going to be delayed. So it needs to be posted at the job site. So got notice commencement, contractor is starting to perform work, and applications for payment start to come in. And typically what's used is in the construction industry is the AIA form application for payment, which Donald is gonna take us through in a second and explain what it means and how to read it. But a couple legal issues that I'll get into. One, I just mentioned subcontractors and suppliers. As an owner, unless there's a payment bond, you want to be able to track who's doing work on your property, the subs and the suppliers. Because when you pay your contractor, after he gives you a application for payment, you want to make sure you're getting releases of lien for the prior payments. You want to make sure that he's paying everyone, because sometimes contractors just don't pay their subs and suppliers, and then an owner will wind up with liens on their property. So you want to make sure that once you pay the contractor, he's paying the subs and suppliers. So that's how you get, and that's called the release of lien, and which is required under 713 Florida statute. So you want to make sure you're getting that. But let's move on to applications for payment. So Donald, why don't you take us through this document and what an owner should know about it?
This document also has a backup document or documents to it. So this is a G702 by the American Institute of Architects. It's got the owner, the contractor name, the project name, the design professional, the architect, the pay period that it covers. Typically, these are monthly. There's a good summary of the original contract sum, what's been changed by executed change orders. When they say net change orders, they must be executed, both positive and negative, which adjusts the contract sum to date. Item number 4 is stored complete, total completed and stored to date. And then retainage is really important. And that's defined in the contract negotiations and needs to match here. And that's the amount of withholding from each payment that is paid based on the terms of the contract, typically towards substantial completion and final completion of the job. There is a backup. There is a certification by the contractor on the right-hand side, and they're swearing to this, the accuracy of this information. And then it goes to the architect to, and if you have an owner's representative, the owner's representative to review. And the architect will certify that they don't have an objection to the amount that's being requested. And the owner's rep should look through the backup information, which typically includes subcontractor invoices, their requisitions, and they have a similar requisition to this, and also prior releases of lien, which we call trailing releases of lien for the previous payment. The contractor will also submit a conditional partial release for the contractor for this payment. And all of that is a bundle of documents, and typically we're seeing this being done electronically now, that everyone submits electronically and the package comes electronically.
So, and I'll show you just the second page, which you had mentioned, Donald.
So this second page is important, and typically there is a schedule of values attached as an exhibit to the contract. Initially, this should match. The scope of work in column B and the schedule of values in column C should match the contract exhibit. As there are change orders, there are line items added to this for change orders. And there are really no jobs without change orders, because change is expected in construction. The goal is to minimize it and to minimize the cost and impact. And then just working across, column D is previously paid. So on the initial payment, those are all zeros. E is this payment. F is materials. Total completed and stored to date is very important, because if you look at the total and the percentage of the total, for example, says 70%, and you look in the field on the job and it only looks less than halfway done, the project's being overbilled. And you want to be very cautious about letting a project be overbilled, because then H, the balance to finish, is inadequate, and your retainage won't be enough either. So you'll have inadequate funds to finish the job should something go wrong. So it's really important to not let a project get overbilled or any line item be overbilled.
Right, and you mentioned change orders, Donald, and I've seen circumstances, whether representing owners or contractors, where change orders are not approved, right, and they're not tracked in this AIA G702 and G703 application for payment because they're not approved. But then the project's done, and all of a sudden there's 20 change orders that now show up in an application for payment. Is there a better way of tracking these change orders and you know, getting them approved or rejected? How do you deal with that?
The contractor typically has a tracking log of pending change orders, and it is a constant process weekly. They get reviewed, and it is common for a project to get to substantial completion or final completion and not all change orders be fully resolved. It's common. It's not uncommon. The less that is left for the end of the job, the better. There are provisions in the contract that allow the owner, through a construction change directive, to essentially force the contractor, order the contractor to do the work on time and material. It can include a cap on that time and material. And the contractor, unless he's ordered to do the work on a construction change directive, can elect not to do the work and delay that part of the project. People should get paid for the work that they do if it wasn't included in the original contract scope. So it's important to resolve those real time.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about who performs inspections on the project. So Donald, as you mentioned, when an application for payment comes in, it's going to either be the architect or perhaps somebody like you reviewing the application for payment, performing inspections on a project to determine how far along the project has proceeded. But when you're doing that type of inspection, are you actually inspecting the work to make sure it conforms to the plans and specifications, or are you just looking at it to see, like you said, well, they're really 50% along, not 70% along?
Some of both, but it's we believe critical to have the design professionals inspect the work for technical compliance with their construction documents. They have the expertise. Owners reps typically are not electrical engineers or mechanical engineers, nor architects or engineers. They're not practicing this stuff. So consequently, we have the architects and engineers as part of the field review process, and they get paid for it. And that protects the quality of the work.
Do you find that architects and engineers sometimes push back on how invasive or how much they will actually be performing inspections? You see that they sometimes don't want to get involved in that process?
Yes, but a big part of it is if they're overloaded with work or if they were compensated to be involved in it. If they get paid for it to go to the field monthly and review with the pay app compliant with their plans and specifications, they shouldn't push back because they're required to certify.
Right, and it's a worthwhile cost, certainly in my opinion, I think in your opinion too, to pay a little bit extra to the architects and engineers to go out there and inspect the work. Maybe a little bit more, but it'll save you potentially a lot more later on, whether it's with defects, inability to operate your property, or a claim and paying me to pursue a claim for construction defects. If you could find something early on, it's much easier and less costly to fix something.
Absolutely.
So beyond just beyond architects and engineers, certainly there's going to be the building department coming out to do their inspections, fire department as well. Why don't you just take us through the differences where some owners elect to use private providers? How does that affect the inspections of the building department?
Private providers can review plans for the issuance of a building permit, which we often use to expedite that process. It's independent of fire. They also can perform inspections on behalf of the building department, but not in substitution of the building department. The building department still has the right, and the fire department, to come out and perform their own inspection. So private providers can help expedite the work and is typically used on large projects because it allows the critical path of the job to be expedited, such as the rough-in in the walls and hanging drywall and finishing the project. Manufacturer reps, such as roofing manufacturers who provide warranties, also inspect the progress of the work. The same goes for waterproofing. The representative providing the warranty for the manufacturer also inspects that work. We also like to have owner-paid private inspectors inspect that work independent of the manufacturer.
And it's my understanding with respect to private providers, they cannot issue a final inspection, right? They cannot perform a final inspection. Is that your understanding?
Correct. It's going to be up to the fire department and the building department.
Okay. And last thing I'll say on this, each one of these, whether it's architects, manufacturers, threshold inspectors, private providers, should be issuing reports based upon what their inspections reveal to the owner to track it and to give to the contractor and subs any failures or anything that needs to be corrected. Who calls for an inspection typically on a project, Donald?
Well, typically the contractor is calling for the inspection with the subcontractor. There can be times when the owner or the authority having jurisdiction can create an inspection on their own. They can just drop in. But typically most inspections are called by the contractor or the trade under their subcontract permit.
And in the contracts I prepare, we specifically state that we not only want a warranty from the contractor and the subcontractors, but any manufacturers providing materials or systems on the project. And for something like a roof, in order for the manufacturer to issue a warranty, the manufacturer is going to need to perform inspections during the installation of its roofing system. So the manufacturer need to be called out to perform those inspections, and we make it clear in the contract that the contractor is responsible for making sure that the manufacturer gets out there and issues the necessary warranty. Okay, who has liability and for what? Something goes wrong on a project, somebody should have inspected it, they didn't, they missed it. What happens? Certainly, contractors and subcontractors have responsibility for their work. Design professionals, it's going to depend on what was missed, right? The standard is whether another architect or engineer in South Florida would have found the particular defect in the work of the contractor or subcontractor. So with respect to design professionals, it depends. Certainly an argument could be made that if there was a defect and the design professionals were performing inspections, they're responsible, they're liable for any costs associated with the repair to that particular deficiency. Manufacturers, certainly if they were out there inspecting the work and given a warranty, and now they found out it was bad, but they would be on the hook for those defects as well. They warranted it based upon the installation. They saw it. Now they're responsible for their warranty. A lot of times I hear is, especially in 5.5A claims where there's construction defects, is, well, we got the city or the county issued a CO. Why aren't those inspectors or the city responsible for these defects? Well, Florida law says building department or inspectors are simply not responsible for construction defects. And there's a number of caveats that are provided in their permits and even in their COs that, their review of the plans and approval of anything does not mean that that they can't come back later and find defects, or that they've inspected every single part of the building. So there's not going to be any liability on the building department for failure to identify deficiencies in the work. Donald, do you have anything to add on that?
Yes, design can also be defective. For example, if there are certain ADA requirements and the architect specifies doors that are too narrow, turning radiuses that are inadequate in bathrooms, a lack of ability to get from the public right-of-way into the building, all those can create liability.
Okay, let's talk about just some issues that we see in terms of claims by contractors. One is, we talked a little bit about already, concealed conditions and unforeseen conditions. Change in legislation. Typically in construction contracts, there is a provision that that will state any changes in the laws could be subject to a change order. If there's something that requires additional work, the contractor will be able to submit a change order for that additional work. Or if work has to be performed in a different manner and it costs money, or perhaps it reduces the cost, those would be subject to change orders by the contractor. But typically, the longer the contract, the more risk there is for a change in legislation. Certainly, unclear plans. Donald, I'm sure you've seen at least a couple times some unclear plans and the ramifications of that. Is that right?
Yes. We see plans that are poorly coordinated, that really don't define the scope of the work in detail with thoroughness. So we ask that the attorney put in clauses in the contract that represent that the plans are schematic in nature. And you see this in, for example, the electrical riser diagrams or plumbing isometric, that they're single line. They're schematic in nature, and that the contractor is required to provide all systems that are operational and fully functional. That doesn't relieve, in my opinion, the design professionals from liability from specifying pumps that are inadequate in size, chiller plants that don't have adequate capacity, and things like that. The contractor is supposed to install the sizes of equipment that's shown on the plan.
Move on to unclear timeline. I mean, I've seen numerous contracts where it just doesn't provide a timeline. And typically you see that where a contractor submits a proposal, kind of bare bones, owner agrees to it, and then contractor's just still not ready. I've seen it in phased contracts. Well, when was one phase going to be done and the second phase to begin? It's just unclear, and that leads to disputes between the parties. And also, I just had a case where there was the parties called an approximate completion date, but there was no provision nor statement in the contract that said that time is of the essence. And if you've been in construction, you've probably seen in construction contracts the phrase "time is of the essence." Well, it's in there for a reason, because if it's not in there, then the parties would have an argument that really, that date, whatever it was, is not really of the essence. It wasn't really important. And so that's why we as attorneys include certain provisions, because they do have meaning and they do affect the parties. So you got to be clear in the contract as to what the timeline is. And even we talked a little bit about change orders. What is the impact on the project due to a change order? I've represented contractors where they've submitted change orders and they say, hey, yeah, this was going to be, extra work. Everyone knew about it. I look at the change order and there's nothing about time. So whether it's, even an owner, if you get a change order like that, and it doesn't have anything about time, well, that needs to be clarified, because you don't want anything to be unclear. You want to be on the same page with your contractor. Is there effect on the schedule? Is there not an effect on the schedule? And that goes back into this whole issue of project documentation. Change orders, is it going to increase the time or is it not? That needs to be clearly identified. And in the contract, what is the schedule? There needs to be a clear date and a schedule attached to it, and any impacts on the schedule will need to be either whether it's due to the owner or due to the contractor. Notice needs to be timely made to either party. And typically in construction contracts, the notice requirements are very strict, and it's important that the parties adhere to those notice requirements, because if they don't, they can be deemed to have waived those notice requirements. Let's go on to a hypothetical here. So the project is halfway done, but the contractor doesn't show up for 2 months. You send letters and make calls demanding that they complete the work, and they blame their subcontractors for abandoning the job. What do you do? What's your recommendation, Donald?
I would have a meeting with the contractor and the sub, and understand what they're thinking and what's going on. The letters that are sent need to be sent in accordance with the contract requirements, because they should likely be default letters. 2 months is a long period of time, even for a project that may take 2 or 3 years. That is significant. And then there may come a time when you have to notice the surety.
Right. And so just like you said, Donald, you look at what the contract says in terms of notice. You have to look at what the bond says in terms of notice. In a typical AIA A312 performance bond, the owner is required to give notice of an intent to declare the contractor in default. And then the surety will then have the right to request a meeting with the owner and the contractor to discuss what the issues are in the project. Then the owner will need to send a notice of default under the contract, and then a notice of termination. Once those 3 notices are sent, at that point, the bonding company has an obligation to make a decision as to what it's going to do with respect to the project, whether bringing in a different contractor, the existing contractor, or deny the claim. But you got to follow those requirements under the bond, or the surety can simply sit back and say, you didn't do what you needed to do to trigger the bond, and thus I have no obligations to you under the bond. And that's very critical. Again, courts will look at those requirements and enforce those requirements. So it's important to get with your counsel, look at the requirements under the contract and the bond, and comply with those preconditions. Another hypothetical. Now the contractor says, well, I haven't been on the project because of this natural disaster. How does that affect things? What do you think, Donald?
They may be entitled to an extension of time, additional general conditions, because the contract may address that through unforeseen conditions.
Right. That goes back to a force majeure type of clause. Certainly that's beyond the contractor's control, a natural disaster. The next thing would be whether it's Donald, someone like Donald as a construction manager, or perhaps the architect acting as the owner's rep. Okay, well, 2 months, are you going to get an extension of time for 2 months, or is it going to be a less amount? That's something that will still have to be addressed between the parties. But clearly, because of a natural disaster, so long as there is a force majeure clause in there, the contractor will be entitled to an extension of time. Then you would get into, okay, you have an extension of time. Are you entitled to additional costs because of the extension of time? And you have, as an owner, you would want to check the contract to see whether there's a no damages for delay provision. Typically, the no damages for delay provision, unless the event is, or the cause of the delay is the exclusive control or fault of the owner, the contractor will not be entitled to any delay damages. So clearly in a natural disaster, that would not be the fault of the owner. And if there is a no damages for delay provision, the contractor would only be entitled to an extension of time, not additional costs for being on the contract longer than anticipated. So common issues during construction, let's address some of these. The quality of the work. So Donald, when you're on a project, you find that the quality of the work is just substandard. What do you do as a owner's rep?
We would notice the contractor on behalf of the owner, require the architect and or engineer to come out and review the work and have the contractor correct the defective work.
And, you know, these are, I want to address a couple of these just because we're running short on time. Talk a little bit about what you see in terms of unapproved substitutions. What happens there?
Sometimes, either intentionally or unintentionally, waterproofing can get substituted, or roofing materials, or many different things. And we find out during the course of construction that the substitution's been made. The owner can demand that it be changed or get a credit back. There are different ways to resolve it. But what's important is that it's dealt with real time rather than waiting until all of the work is done, the finishes are on, and there's a lot of destruction necessary to change the substitution, which may be inferior.
I want to talk a little bit about this last one, disruption to residents. Even before COVID-19, you know, Donald works with a lot of condos. I work with a lot of condos. Construction work, renovation work, 40-year certification work, concrete works, stucco work on a condo can be very disruptive to residents. Just before COVID-19, we would have to deal with contractors having to close balconies, whether it's because maybe they're just installing a new railing or the contractor has a swing stage going down that particular line, and they don't want anybody coming out on their balcony and potentially damaging or doing anything to the swing stage. And that causes a major disruption to residents. They simply just can't use their balcony. So we've had to deal with those issues. But I think COVID, just because people are working from home, before, hey, contractor, you can work from 9 to 4, right? Everyone's at work, and go ahead during the weekdays, work from 9 to 4, no issues. But now we have people working from home, and we have the chiseling, the banging, the construction workers around the property. How have you dealt with that, and have you seen that become an issue for your condo clients?
It's clearly an issue for the residents, but the reality is that they want the work done, especially on an exterior concrete restoration and painting. The balconies have to be secure. It's a sacrifice that residents make in engaging the work, irrespective of COVID or not. I live in a building that we're replacing both banks of elevators. There are 3 elevators. It's a 30-story building. It's tremendously disruptive, and we've got swings on the outside of the building doing concrete restoration at the same time during COVID. We've had to live with that. That's the sacrifice of living in a condominium and living in a high-rise building.
And certainly one thing that an owner such as an association can do is talk to the contractor. How do we expedite this? Can you get more crews on the project? What is the cost to do it, to supplement the labor force to increase the speed of the project so residents don't have to suffer as much? Resolution. So there's issues, and sometimes it happens. The contractor simply does not perform, and what does an owner do? Well, certainly the option is, like I said before, default, terminate, bring in somebody else to replace the contractor. Another option is to supplement the labor force of the contractor. How have you seen that work out, Donald? Is that a viable option?
Supplementing can be tricky. None of this is easy. Terminating and replacing a non-performing party, whether it's a subcontractor, replacing a subcontractor is easier than replacing the general contractor, because potentially you could lose many of the subcontractors doing that. Typically, there's a clause that allows the owner to retain the subcontractors and transfer them to a new contractor. Supplementing workforce is, again, it's tricky. It's best to have an agreement with the contractor or the sub when that's done. A bond claim, you know better than me, it can take a long time. And the surety, their client, is actually the contractor. And they typically make decisions that align with the contractor and help fight claims by the owner. For the owner, it's insurance. For the contractor, it's a credit line. And it's very risky because it typically bonds the entire contract up. It's best to settle claims by mutual agreement rather than litigation, if possible, and do it real time.
Right, because even bringing in a new contractor, I've seen this before, I'm sure you've seen it, is, the new contractor's walking into a problem. So there's more risk, and he likely knows that the owner is getting desperate to finish the project, and I'm sure there's going to be a premium on his price to come in. And plus, there's going to be an issue as what work is he going to be responsible for? Is he going to agree to take over the entire project and be responsible for all the prior work of the contractor? If there's a defect, you know he's going to point the finger at the prior contractor and say, well, that wasn't what I did. That was the prior contractor. So there's going to be issues even going forward, warranty claims against a new contractor, who's responsible for what, and trying to decipher whether it's the original or the new contractor performed the work. So certainly sometimes you need to take that step and terminate, but as Donald said, it's best to try to, if you can, resolve the claims and complete the project. All right, we're at the end, ready to close it out. There's always a punch list. Donald, why don't you just, how do you deal with punch lists and closing out a punch list? What's the best way to do that?
Punch lists are tracked in detail, whether it's in Prolog or some other software. It's something that requires vigilance. And if there's a claim outstanding, getting punch lists completed can be complicated. It complicates the performance of the subs and contracts. So I think it's important to do punch lists as the job proceeds, so that when you get to the end of the job, the punch list is minimal.
And from the legal side, you're closing out the project. Look at what the contract says in terms of the precondition to final payment. It's typically going to require releases of lien from not only the contractor, but the subs and suppliers, warranties from the contractor, subs and suppliers, manufacturers, and any other closeout documents. It's certainly much easier to get all that information from the contractor before you make payment to him. Because once you make payment to him and you're continuing to ask for documents, it may be a little bit more difficult to get things out of them. So while you got the hammer over him, he wants the money, make sure you follow the contract, get those documents, and then pay him. All right, I think that's it. Appreciate everyone's time. We do have our contact information. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. And Stephanie Bowman, who is our marketing coordinator with Siegfried Rivera, is going to give you guys a little bit of information as to, I believe, credits and making sure you get your credits for this presentation.
Yes,
Stephanie,
hi.
are you there?
Thank you everybody for attending once again. We will be sending all participants a copy of the PowerPoint as well as a link to this video. In addition, any property manager that attended and provided us with their license number, we will be reporting credit to the division on their behalf and also emailing them a certificate of completion. So that's all for those announcements.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. Be safe.